Chapter 13 in my book deals with Edward Conzer, and Edward Conzer is one of the greatest Buddhist scholars of the 20th century. He was also a practicing Buddhist, and in that chapter I deal a lot with European history. And so the question is, why on earth, when I'm writing about Buddhism, do I talk about European history? The reason for this is that you can't really understand Conzer without understanding his background and what brought him to Buddhism. And basically, I would say that two things brought him to Buddhism. One was his disillusionment with Germany, his disillusionment with the old regime in Germany, which went into the First World War and lost the First World War. And secondly, his disillusionment with the relationship between Christianity and the German regime. But not only the German regime, also what went on in Britain as well. During the First World War, God was on our side, whichever side you were on. And the Germans really did believe that they were in the right, and that what they were doing was simply standing up for justice, because the Archduke Ferdinand had been assassinated by Serbian terrorists, and they wanted to bring, or the Austrians wanted to bring the Serbs to justice. The terrorists were sheltered by Serbia. Russia immediately rushed to the aid of the Serbs and mobilized its army before the Austrians did, before the Germans did. And this led to the outbreak of the First World War. So many of the Germans felt that they had been cheated in the war, particularly by the Treaty of Versailles, which said that the Germans were guilty for the war, when in fact they hadn't started it at all. It was started between really the Austrians and the Serbs, or the Austrians and the Russians, depending on which way one sees the events being triggered. And this left disillusionment. Conzer had been a good German until the war broke out. And then he was horrified by the war. His father was actually a German judge who worked as a military judge during the war, and was horrified by the atrocities that were committed by the Russians in particular on the Eastern Front. But when the Germans committed atrocities, one's got to say they were brought to trial. He doesn't see the Russians doing a similar thing. But his father did execute or order the execution of a number of German soldiers who had raped women and things like this. And all of these events really shocked Conzer. And he talks in his autobiography about finding photographs of the rape of Russian and German women in the war and how horrific that was. And these were by armies that were claiming to be Christian. So he became very disillusioned with Christianity. He then, during the 1930s, he joined the Communist Party, and he joined the Communist Party in the 20s rather, to oppose the Nazis. And he was very strongly opposed to the Nazis until 1933, when the Nazis gained power, and a friend of his was arrested and beaten to pulp by them. And this really shocked him very deeply. And he was then visited by the SS. And the SS said, look, we've just come to power, Dr. Conzer. We know you're actually a British citizen because you've been born in Britain. And we don't want to arrest you and create problems with Britain. So just go back there. Get out of our way. So he went to Britain, and he took with him his Jewish wife, and they lived in Britain throughout the Second World War. After the war, he went back to Germany, and he saw the bombing of Germany, and he was horrified again by the carpet bombing of German cities, in particular the bombing of Hamburg, where he had worked as a communist, organizing street fights against the Nazis. And there he found that the working class areas, which had been strongly communist, had received the brunt of the bombing. The wealthier areas, which he claimed were where the Nazi supporters lived, had got off scot-free. So all of this disillusioned him very deeply. And in response to this, he had read various books about Buddhism from 1915 onwards. And these books showed the futility of life. And gradually, as a response to this, and as a response to the conditions around him, he embraced Buddhism. So that by the time he went to Britain, he realized that the political situation was hopeless. He began practicing meditation very seriously once he got to Britain. Before that, he dabbled in Buddhism. But then he started really practicing meditation, practicing Buddhism. He became one of the leading Buddhist scholars of the world, and he committed himself fully to Buddhism. He later on taught in America. He taught Buddhism in America and was very well received through his books and his works. But always he had a sort of sympathy for what he saw as a pure Christianity. If Christianity had lived up to what it should be, he might even have become a Christian. He had a lot of dialogues with particularly Catholic priests that he records, talking to them about religious issues. And none quite convinced him. There are occasions when he came very close to being convinced, but it was always the action of Christians that really soured him. And at one point, according to him at least, and I think this is true, and this is how I came to actually meet him, was he was teaching in Seattle, and he went back to England because his wife was English, he was a British citizen, during the summer vacation, flew back to America, and was refused entry because somebody had squealed on him and said this guy was a communist during the 1930s. And that coincided with an invitation he'd received from the Americans to testify at the United Nations about the priests in Vietnam who were committing suicide by burning themselves as a protest against the Vietnamese War. And he was a pacifist by that time. And so he didn't want to testify at the UN in anyone's favor. He was totally opposed to the Vietnam War and to any war. And that again disillusioned him. So he was taken in by Ninian Smart back in Britain when he got there, and he taught at the University of Lancaster, and that's where he taught me. He was a very interesting scholar. He was a very good scholar. He paid a lot of attention to students, and he treated particularly Christian students very well. Christian students, after all, believed something. He didn't like the atheists who didn't believe anything. He thought they were very shallow. But he did recognize religious belief as being important, and he thought it was the basis of society. But what had turned him away from Christianity was simply disillusionment with the actions of Christians. And this is why I spend so much time working on him, because one often wonders what explains the spread of Buddhism and Hinduism in the 20th century in Christian countries. Why does Christianity collapse in Europe? Why do we see even today at the beginnings, perhaps, of a collapse of Christianity in North America? And a lot of it is to do with the way Christians behave. And I think this is a warning from history.